The Deus Ex series has been around for 16 years, and despite every sequel having to live up to the reputation of what many consider to be the greatest PC game of all time, I don't think there's been a bad one yet. And I say that because I think Invisible Warfare gets kind of a bad rap from fans. I've always thought that the weakest link in this franchise is still a good game when judging it alone by its own merits. But what's going to be interesting now is whether or not fans will consider Mankind Divided to be the new weakest link. It's got problems, really bizarre, glaring problems, but it's easily the most enjoyable AAA I've played this year and certainly does its franchise justice. If you have doubts and think that Square Enix has strayed from the past to make a simplified, dumbed-down corridor shooter out of Deus Ex, you really shouldn't, because this is the same team that put out Human Revolution, and they've iterated on its concepts with this one, only adding more features and more complicated maps onto their slick interpretation of how a modern Deus Ex should play. A core of first-person stealth with a third-person cover system optimized for sneaking rather than combat has you wisping in and out of layers with simple, clean, satisfying line-of-sight rules that feel a lot like a Western version of Metal Gear Solid. That's combined with a healthy assortment of intel tools and vertical navigation abilities and different kinds of hacking with non-linear levels diligently designed to make use of all of those systems. That's happening inside of dense civilian hubs, honeycombed with secrets and tunnels and side quests, and populated by AIs that change modes to adapt to new situations that create unpredictable, but logical and replayable gameplay scenarios. I like how Deus Ex's dystopia is extra depressing because on top of having to deal with the Illuminati ruining everything behind the scenes, everyone's also got to deal with you breaking into their apartments and stealing all their beer. In other words, these hubs are seamlessly connected to tons of smaller apartment-sized areas of unique stealth challenges, rigged with rude Goldberg machines of obstacles that the player can trigger in all sorts of weird ways, daisy-chaining into all sorts of weird outcomes.
Human presence detected. Engaging smart home system. You have chosen not to leave. Please confine yourself to a corner and wait for local authorities to arrive.
Well, that's unusual.
Security is of utmost
Moving to alarm panel!
Moments like that keep things classic. Way back in 1998, the first game was planned to create immersion not through fancy graphics, but rather fancy level design, with maps that felt like simulationist worlds rather than shooting gallery tunnels. And 16 years later, that's an ethos that Mankind Divided still strives towards, maybe even more so than its predecessors. There's a lot of different ways through this game, and a lot of them don't look obvious. A lot of them involve carefully wrestling your way into areas that don't look like they should be accessible and don't even have anything useful, but the game still goes along with it, even giving you a little exploration bonus because the developers knew you'd want to go there. Your most basic, quiet moments of navigation in this one are a treat. It feels good to really go far out of your way to solve a problem creatively, like you pulled off some real act of ingenuity. And a lot of that positive feedback is knowing that somewhere along the lines, you can sequence break away from their intended upgrade path. I can't wait to see some of the crazy tricks that crazy players are going to come up with, because the systems here can allow for them. And more often than not, the game chugs along beautifully and actually reveals how it can handle your agency even when you do something to try and break it. For a little while, I ran around like a lunatic, throwing boxes in people's faces, and that just revealed how cops who don't witness your crimes don't shoot because they don't know it's you, even though they get the alert status from the other cops and get ready for a threat coming from their direction. Hell, there was one moment where I was sneaking around some place in the back of a shop I wasn't allowed to sneak around, causing a guard to flip on hostile mode and pull a gun on me, which ended up alerting the cops, but since they witnessed his rule breaking, not mine, they ended up chasing after him. Sure, the process looked janky as hell, but I was grinning like a little baby seeing these AI systems go to work, and knowing that some speedrunner out there might be able to use that unscripted AI as a legit strategy. That's really cool. So in terms of level design and its relationship with AI and the player ability to throw wrenches into the world, things are pretty solid. They are totally neato. But unfortunately, that level design is the one quality where you're gonna have to decide what exactly Deus Ex means to you. Close your eyes and think of the words Deus Ex and paint a mental picture of what they mean. Deus Ex. Do you picture A, a large interactive and reactive FPS RPG world built out of movable parts that create lots of replay value? Or do you imagine B, an iconic example of cyberpunk sci-fi, a brainy spy adventure about uncovering conspiracies across the globe? If you think of B, or even of a balance between the two, oh boy. There are a lot of elements to Mankind Divided that feel like the game was rushed to completion. For all the additions they made to Human Revolution's gameplay, they still haven't figured out how to fix the problem of your AUG energy always being low. Rare and expensive consumable items are needed to keep that meter anywhere above 15-ish%, so expect to never really use the greater spread of powers they give you in this one. For that matter, the main quest isn't exactly taxing on your abilities too hard either. I recommend starting on Gimme Deus Ex mode and definitely tackle every side quest they throw at you. Because for some weird reason it's the side quests in this one, not the main quests, that have you sneaking around the biggest Rube Goldberg levels of them all to feel like you're pulling off the heist of the century. For that matter, turn off the objective waypoints too. They don't always work properly, and it's not easy to get lost in this game. But preventing the tunnel vision that those waypoints encourage can help set up the wacky emergent gameplay it's good at. Other weird red flags include shopkeepers who get mad and act like you didn't buy anything even though you did.
That's not just a display. They're for sale.
Your sprinting animation sure can't be taken seriously, and sprinting on stairs makes you slower than the walking speed for some reason. But the biggest evidence of some kind of time pressure pushing this project out too fast, which is weird because they had 5 years, is its narrative design. The story starts off like it's missing some kind of intro act. Kinda. Adam Jensen is juggling competing interests, and you don't know why. In fact, within that vital first hour, this isn't really explained outside of objective descriptions. A character who just comes straight out of nowhere talks a lot of jargon from the last game during what looks like a Skyrim-esque movable cutscene intro even after the game already starts with a perfectly fine tutorial level. It does that Metroid Prime thing where some mid-game powers from the tutorial level get stripped away to introduce you and then ease you into how the game works. Except that power stripping event happens twice, even after 4 hours of playing the game where you're already used to them. 8 hours in, I was doing a firing range tutorial teaching me how to press the reload button. It comes in straight out of nowhere and is really placed in a weird part of the story, and examples like that just keep coming in. Plot threads get left hanging, characters who don't get a real introduction suddenly become important, and very poor usage of the game's FMV scenes show the harsh, grinding contrast between its excellent level design and its bewildering narrative design.
I'm heading for an area called the Throat now.
Example, apparently I'm about to approach the Throat. Though no one's told me about the Throat, I've never heard of that before. I don't know how Jensen knows about the Throat. Clicking this door 2 rooms later teleports you into a cutscene where this guy tells you to get ready to approach the Throat.
I know this place up ahead. We call it the Throat.
It's a minor example, but just 2 of several assets in this game that feel like they were put in the wrong place. And it's kinda sad that after a game from 16 years ago set the bar for narrative design and world building so high, the latest Eidos Montreal games have left the standards for a Deus Ex story in pretty shaky hands. Which means I have to talk about the big elephant in the room, the controversial metaphor that Eidos Montreal has chosen as the focal point of all this game's conflicts: racism. Note, Deus Ex invites more political discussion than perhaps any other mainstream gaming franchise out there. Every game deals with real-life issues taken to dystopic extremes, whether it's the influence of political elites, terrorism, transhumanism, or in this one, racism. The games are openly designed to invite political commentary. After all, this is a game whose launch events included a pseudo-academic panel discussion, so God help us. One last thing, I love you. It shouldn't be controversial to compare real-life racism to Mankind Divided's fiction. That is the word in-game text used to describe the situation. Augmented cyborg people have apparently developed a kind of racial identity when faced with a world that's enforcing full-on Jim Crow apartheid-style segregation. And I could go on all day picking holes in the metaphor, but to save myself time and trouble, I won't. I stayed up 2 nights thinking about how to respectfully say this, so here we go. District 9 is a fun sci-fi movie about wacky aliens that makes a meaningful allegory for racism. Mankind Divided is a fun game about sneaking around places that make allegories for racism, but the problem rears with how vast the difference between the gameplay and its story really is. The issue with the world building and narrative of this particular game's idea grinds against the sequel baggage coming out of the last game hard, to the point where the allegory just gets lost in translation. And I wonder how much of its effectiveness was lost in the attempt to make it relevant, deep, and meaningful first, and coherent and entertaining second, all the while juggling what happened previously in Deus Ex. Between the Augs and the Naturals here, it's the Augs that are the ones who end up impoverished and huddled into ghettos, even though these are the same upperclassers who had the money to buy and maintain Augs in the first place. Seeing them suddenly move to a position of poverty and powerlessness during that 2-year gap seems like a really thin stretch, so to clarify that contradiction we have the Aug incident, a bit of backstory that creates the anti-Aug stereotype that the people of this world hate so much. And it's also a major spoiler for the ending of the last game, something that pokes the biggest holes in the racism metaphor of this game, and an extraordinarily convenient ass pull. Fun fact, the Machina, erased from the title of Deus Ex, was also a jab at the convenient contrivances of game stories during that time. It was a protest of easy plot resolutions. So Mankind Divided's narrative is a very strange one on quite a few levels. It's a narrative whose express purpose is to flip the power fantasy of cyborg augmentation on its head, but it does it with a metaphor that's not really compatible. It's hard to feel like you're oppressed when the nature of your oppression means you can blow people up with the flip of a switch. This is such a weird example, but the first hour of Majora's Mask did it way better. But as we near a cyberpunk dystopia of our own in real life, a fun and interesting story about identity politics taken to the extreme is more necessary than ever. Certain elements of this plot could and may be as prophetic as certain elements of the first games, but playing through it right now in the heat of the moment makes all of its story threads look like a plate of spaghetti. And that's even without you zigzagging back and forth to different cities across the globe. There's something less romantic, less James Bondy about uncovering a global conspiracy from just the one city of Prague. At the same time, I feel both sorry for and impressed by the designers of this game. The hubs they made for this one city were big, complicated, and lively enough to fit in some of the best level designs out of the whole franchise. But I'd hate for that to get forgotten if the game instead gains a reputation for having some of the worst narrative design of the whole franchise. And that wishy-washy, half-good, half-bad nature extends even to the quality of the PC port, which crashed a hell of a lot and performs pretty bad for me, but holy crap, they have in-game menu sliders for 3D depth and pop-out? That's something that the original 3D Vision-ready games from 2010 didn't even have, and that was when the tech was still relevant. On the other hand, for some reason, E is the same button to read new objectives and move bodies, so you can get stuck doing both actions because they're on the same button. But you can customize and resize almost every single piece of the HUD, which ended up helping the game way out by a lot when I turned all that fluff off. It's a game where you can see the parts that were delicately crafted with all the care and attention in the world, nervously squirming next to the parts that didn't get so much love. It's like there was a team who made the levels who spent 5 years delicately polishing them up and making them play beautifully, and then a different team came in to place cutscenes and audio cues, and they didn't know what they were doing even weeks before launch. It's like 2 different people made 2 different tutorials and couldn't agree on where to put them, so they both slid them into parts of the story that made sense, but not the part of the game that made sense. Regardless, it still begins like it's missing some piece of opening chapter, like a comic book or a DLC that never came out is filling in the gaps we're missing, and it ends like that too. Which brings me to an equally confused conclusion. I can harp on about how little sense the story makes, and how its unenthusiastic voice acting and convoluted stakes make it so hard to care about any of it, but ultimately, at the end of the day, I still think gameplay is king. The gameplay's great here, it's fantastic. So I went nuts with it. I had a blast with it now over the past week, but I'm just worried that without memorable narrative elements to go with it, it's not going to remain memorable after a year or two. So compared to Invisible War, it is a long way from being the weakest link of the series, but depending on what you're looking for out of the series, it might have come a bit too close for comfort here. Hopefully they'll do a director's cut edition again. It feels like a lot of fixing this game is just sliding its narrative pieces into different slots.